Let's talk about the call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I want to play a part of Jake Sullivan's comments over the weekend discussing the fuel issue. This is with Jen Psaki.
The president has also made clear that he believes that fuel needs to get first to the UN trucks that are distributing this aid around the country, and then second to critical infrastructure like hospitals, and that we should work out a way to get fuel to those places so that Hamas can't divert it, steal it, or use it for military purposes.
Are you concerned about frustration within the White House mounting really a pivot in the last couple of days because of the humanitarian crisis? The president has expressed it publicly and privately, as has Secretary Blinken.
First of all, we welcome the very solid support that we've received from President Biden, his moral clarity and material support as well, in explaining that Israel is dealing with a terror organization that is worse than ISIS, and the U.S. will make sure Israel has everything it needs to win this war. And that's our starting point. Now, as for the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, we want to see humanitarian aid reach the people of Gaza through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. And of course, we're discussing with international partners ways to step up humanitarian aid. We have only one condition, which is our right and duty under international law, and that's to make sure that resources not reach Hamas, that Hamas, which perpetrated the October 7th massacre, not exploit those humanitarian corridors in order to rearm. Now, here's an example. You mentioned the question of fuel. We know, for example, that Hamas, the governing body in the Gaza Strip, has stockpiled 500,000 liters of fuel, 130,000 gallons. Now, what can you do with 500,000 liters of fuel? That's enough to circumnavigate the globe in a Boeing 747, just to give you an impression of how much fuel Hamas has stockpiled. Now, we have an obligation to protect our citizens, and we have an obligation to make sure that the fuel not reach Hamas. What's the problem? Hamas controls the distribution of resources inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas also decides when to steal resources from international agencies. It's only been 2 weeks since the UN admitted in a tweet that it has since deleted under pressure from Hamas that Hamas stole fuel from its own stockpiles. Hamas stole 24,000 liters of fuel from the United Nations, which is now covering it up. So, of course, we want to see humanitarian aid reach the people of Gaza, but we also can't allow the international community's goodwill to be exploited by the terrorists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre in order to rearm and refuel their machine of war and terror against our people.
Is there a way for humanitarian pause in order to get escorted fuel in through the International Red Cross, through other agencies? Because people are dying in these hospitals without the generators, without the fuel that they need, without incubators for children, which need electricity. Isn't there any way to save some of these innocent people by getting fuel deliveries in and work out a way with Qatar? I mean, you're negotiating with all these people in any case. But you have to pause the bombing in order for that to happen. You've contained Hamas. They can't break through. You've got them surrounded. Isn't there some way to have these brief pauses?
Members of the international community that want to see fuel reach the people of Gaza should insist that Hamas, the governing body in the Gaza Strip, release the fuel that it already controls. We know, for example, that Hamas's main operational command center is located in the basement of the Shifa hospital in Gaza. Now, I promise you, Hamas and its tunnels underneath that hospital have all the fuel they need to ventilate those tunnels. The fuel exists. The problem is that Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, prefers to use that fuel to ventilate its tunnels under the hospitals instead of releasing it for the hospital ventilators above ground. Now, it's been 3 weeks that hospitals in Gaza have said, in 24 hours, we're going to run out of fuel, and yet they don't. First of all, because many of them have solar power. Okay, that's part of the fuel response inside the Gaza Strip. But it's also because Hamas has been drip feeding fuel to these hospitals in order to keep them operational. Why has Hamas been drip feeding fuel to the hospitals? Because it wants to continue using innocent Palestinians as human shields in order to shield the military targets that are located underneath those hospitals. That is, of course, a grave breach of international law under the Geneva Conventions for any army, not to mention a brutal ISIS-like terror organization, to use human civilians in that way as human shields. The fuel exists in the Gaza Strip for all of the humanitarian needs. but it's controlled by Hamas. The same Hamas that we're concerned, if we allow more fuel into the Gaza Strip, is going to requisition those supplies anyway. And you don't have to take our word for it. The New York Times published just yesterday or the day before an article stating clearly there is one group in the Gaza Strip that remains well stocked in terms of fuel and food and all other sources: Hamas. Hamas, the same regime that controls the Gaza Strip and has been doing so for 16 years. So the resources are there. And we think that anyone who is concerned with the humanitarian situation in Gaza, as we are, should insist that the governing authorities there release what they have stockpiled for a long and drawn-out war against our people, for the people in the Gaza Strip, because it is unacceptable to be hoarding those stockpiles like that, to continue their machine of war and terror against our people, instead of giving it to the people who need it there.
And no one is questioning the fact that it is a war crime to use hostages as a human shield. Let me ask you about the fact that Hamas also released a propaganda video, including 3 Israeli hostages, with a direct message to the prime minister, as Israeli forces are trying to eliminate Hamas in tunnels where these hostages may be held. Is that a cause of concern for you as you map your strategy and where you go with, with your weapons and with your attacks?
We're not going to comment on Hamas's war of psychological warfare against us, but I will say this. Of course, watching the video was extremely difficult. These are very, very poor women, 3 of 239 hostages at least, who were abducted from their homes and taken into the Gaza Strip. And I heard your correspondent just before I went on air saying it's unclear whether they were speaking under duress. They're being held in a dark tunnel by armed men with black balaclavas and holding Kalashnikov rifles. That's the definition of duress. And of course, our hearts go out to them. No one should be abducted from their beds and held by ISIS-like terrorists inside the Gaza Strip. And we're doing everything that we can to bring them home. Those are the twin aims of our fight against Hamas and this war that it declared on us.
I want to point out that we're not playing their comments or even quoting for them or showing them on screen for that very reason. They're obviously under duress, and it is horrendous that it's being used that way. And just one quick question. I know you've told people move from the north to the south, but that route is being bombed as we speak. So how can they move safely from the north to the south?
We take very seriously our obligation to protect civilians from harm. That's why on the Israeli side, we've ordered a mass evacuation of over 100,000 people on our side, including sick and elderly people. And in the Gaza Strip, we've asked people also to get out of harm's way temporarily for their safety. We know that it's going to be difficult, but it's been 2.5 weeks. Because it's been 2.5 weeks. I'll explain. It's been 2.5 weeks since Israel gave them an initial 24-hour warning to move. Now, Hamas continues to act within the whole Gaza Strip. The reason we're asking them to get out of the north is because that's where Hamas has most of its tunnels under their homes. But I'll give you an example. Just last week, the IDF struck a Hamas missile launcher in Khan Yunis. Now, that is obviously by any standard a legitimate military target, and we're going after the whole terror infrastructure that has been attacking our people since the October 7th massacre, and indeed for the last 16 years. But we're asking them to get out of the north because that is where Hamas has embedded itself most deeply in civilian areas in order to use them cynically as human shields. So we're asking them to get out of the most dangerous areas.
Just to say, there are many people too ill to move. There are people in hospitals who cannot move. So I know you gave them plenty of warning, but there have been rocket attacks in the interim.
And we will continue, of course, to apply those core principles of proportionality and distinction under international law. We take those very seriously. But Israel has also been forced to evacuate sick and elderly people because we have no choice. We want to get them out of harm's way. And we think that anyone in the international community concerned for civilians in Gaza should be urging them to do everything possible to heed Israel's warning, to get out of harm's way for their own safety until the war is over and we can rebuild.
Well, for many people who have land exits other than the people in Gaza, there is an escape, but we have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you.
Appreciate it.